Did you know that every time you pick up your smartphone out of boredom, it's doing two things to your brain? And whatever it does to your brain, we still don't fully know what long-term effects of that will be. We all have smartphones now, from the smartphone in your pocket to the smartphone on the wall, to the smartphone on your fridge. Smartphones plague us all. But what kind of plague exactly? While I'm mostly joking about the phones on the fridge and the phones on the wall, has science proven that phones will kill us all? No. As best we know, smartphones aren't exactly an existential threat. But the concerning thing is, smartphones are such a new, yet such a transformative technology, we still don't know what the full extent to which they are affecting us is. What apps do you most commonly use? Well, according to one SimilarWeb's analysis of the most used apps of August in 2025, the top 50 apps aren't that interesting, actually. But removing the apps that most people think are essential does give us a more interesting picture. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the most common thing people use their smartphones for outside of the essentials is to fend off boredom. Just the top 5 apps on that list alone have Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. According to the CDC, half of all teenagers spend 4 or more hours on their phone each day, with some estimates being as high as 7.5 hours for the average teen. Now, there are several great books on the psychological and societal effects this may be having, but what I want to focus on is something that I haven't heard that many people talking about, and that's the effects that it's having on our brains. To explain why I'm concerned about smartphones, I'll have to dig a bit into the neurobiology of what's actually going on. The feeling of pleasure and motivation that we think about whenever we do something that we like is associated with a particular neurotransmitter, or a chemical, called dopamine. Now, dopamine is used in a lot of different ways throughout the brain, not just pleasure, but when it's released in 2 specific pathways, it results in a feeling of desire or motivation. Now, the first of the 2 specific dopamine pathways, or regions in the brain, is called the mesolimbic pathway. When dopamine is released in the mesolimbic pathway, we experience a feeling of immediate or instant gratification. Think taking a bite of food that you like, or drinking cold water on a hot day. Now, the second pathway is called the mesocortical pathway. When dopamine is released here, it gives us that feeling of moving towards a long-term goal, so delayed gratification. Think having a good study session, or skipping a slice of cake to lose weight. Again, I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but all we need to understand is that we have 2 different motivation centers, one for instant gratification and one for delayed gratification. Okay, but how does any of this relate to our smartphones? Well, the way it's related to our smartphones is causing 2 key problems. Problem number 1 is overstimulation. Before the modern age of smartphones, people were required to look for novel ways of stimulating these 2 dopaminergic pathways. That sounds complicated. All I'm saying is that people had to look for ways to avoid being bored. Whether that was picking up a book, or going for a walk, dragging yourself over to the family computer, or flipping through the TV channels. Now, how damaging these other forms of entertainment are may be a topic worth discussing. Are they better or worse than smartphones? Who knows? The reason smartphones in particular are concerning is because they are with us 24/7. I don't know about you, but I've never found myself channel surfing on a CRT that I brought with me while waiting in line at the DMV, and that's likely to be true of you too. Scrolling through Instagram, though, that might be a different story. Okay, so we don't have to be bored anymore. What's the problem? The problem is, if you overstimulate these pathways in your brain, you become desensitized to whatever it is you're trying to pay attention to. And the fact that everyone has all the stimulation they could possibly imagine sitting in their pockets every single day, it's bound to have profound impacts on a person.
When it comes to focus, I mean, much of what our schooling is about growing up is not just the content that we're taught, but our ability to sit still and pay attention, to keep the body still and to focus to some extent, keep the body still. If one is constantly moving their attention from one thing to the next, it undermines the stability of all the circuitry in the brain that's responsible for prolonged focus. Now, when you're on your phone and scrolling, and I think scrolling itself is the major issue, when you're scrolling, you're essentially putting yourself into new context after new context after new context, and the brain has to adjust to all of that.
A study published all the way back in 2019 demonstrated a number of similarities between individuals with social media addictions and those with substance abuse disorders. These similarities include a preoccupation with the object of their addiction, when not actively using, mood modifications when the addiction is indulged, and most notably, a tolerance to the rewards associated with the indulgence. This last point in particular is important because it means that social media use is a positive feedback loop where someone initially feels bored. They get rid of their boredom by opening an app, and once they close that app, that sense of boredom returns, and the cycle repeats. Except with each repetition, they need to engage more with that app for the same amount of entertainment. This, by the way, may explain the over 7 hours of daily screen time reports for teenagers I mentioned earlier. Now, I wanted to bring up this topic of dopamine fasting or dopamine detox. If you've never heard of it before, these practices essentially boil down to pursuing as few dopamine hits as possible while you're engaged in the fast or detox. I have absolutely nothing against them. I think it's great that enough people know about this issue for dopamine fasting as a practice to even exist. One of the issues with dopamine fasting, however, is that it's oftentimes touted as a cure or a quick fix for a long-term problem. Are there benefits to a well-informed dopamine fast? Obviously, yes. Will you be able to undo years of mindless scrolling with a 2-day fast, though? No, you can't. And to see why, I think it's important to discuss the second thing that smartphones are doing to our brains.
This is the other important thing. When that person said that you do this for 24 hours ain't going to do crap, because the neurophysiology of what's going on is receptor adaptation. So receptor adaptation requires weeks to equilibrate. So if you think about, if you go off of caffeine for 24 to 36 hours, you're not going to be detoxed off of caffeine, right? Like, you're just going to be miserable for 24 hours and you're not going to be totally fine. So if you also think about alcohol addiction, so for example, alcohol addiction can take anywhere from like 5 to 6 days for the medically dangerous part. And then you can even have lingering effects of chronic alcohol use for weeks to months as your neurochemistry like readapts and your neurons start developing new cellular machinery and stuff like that. It gets actually quite complicated. So what we're going to do for dopamine detox, the goal is to fix that receptor regulation.
The second problem I'm about to discuss is a bit more complex. As I mentioned moments ago, there are 2 different pathways dopamine is released in to elicit that feeling of pleasure or motivation in particular. The first is the instant gratification pathway, and truth be told, that's the pathway that's actually being stimulated when you're on your phone. The second is delayed gratification. Whenever you're scrolling or bouncing from one video to another, it primarily activates the instant gratification pathway rather than the delayed gratification pathway, and there's nothing wrong with that. There are literally thousands of things that we do that may stimulate this pathway over the other. Now, this second problem comes in when we consider that almost all of the overstimulation people experience from smartphone use comes from just one of the 2 dopaminergic pathways. Again, that's the mesolimbic or the instant gratification pathway. Now, historically, it's not unreasonable to speculate that these 2 pathways usually fired at a relatively stable ratio one to another. For every firing of the instant pathway, the delayed pathway fired roughly a set number of times. Obviously, that ratio changes depending on the person's personality, environment, current pursuits, etc. But breaking far away from that ratio would require a very unusual set of circumstances. That isn't true anymore for anyone with a smartphone. Now, everyone has a device that provides them nearly limitless amounts of stimulation for the instant gratification pathway, and only sparing amounts of stimulation for the delayed pathway. Now, it's important to note that every time a neural pathway fires, it can have a number of downstream effects, changing the way the brain itself is wired. So what happens to someone when 2 of their dopamine pathways are meant to fire at a specific ratio, but one fires non-stop and the second pathway is only fired sparingly? I don't have an answer for that. It really is possible that no one knows what effects this broken ratio is having on us. About those downstream effects I mentioned earlier, those effects could literally change the way the brain is wired.
That's a better way to put it. So this is key, because essentially what happens, our mesolimbic pathway is sort of active, but something about our reward circuitry builds up tolerance, so it doesn't actually feel fun. So this is the other thing that happens, is that there's this war between the mesocortical and the mesolimbic. So the second feature of like when your dopamine circuits are messed up is that you should do something, but you can't. This like weird basal mesolimbic circuit is actually ending up being stronger than the mesocortical circuit, which in turn means this part of your brain that is telling you, okay, these are the planned actions I need to take, I need to execute them in this way, is losing to the immediately rewarding behavior.
Neuroplasticity is a word used to describe the brain's capacity to rewire itself. This rewiring happens whenever a particular pathway fires in unexpected ways, like when one particular pathway fires more than another pathway. Now, the concerning thing about neuroplasticity is that the brain is very susceptible to rewiring up until around age 25, meaning that children and teenagers have much more neuroplasticity than adults do. It's the most susceptible people, children and teenagers, who are spending the most of their time with the very thing putting them at risk. Now, there are dozens of problems that have cropped up in society that are clearly hitting the youngest generation the hardest. These problems range from psychological to economic, problems that plague young girls in similar yet unique ways as they do young boys, and many different people from many different fields have been taking notice. I can't say whether or not these issues are related to the concerns that I've brought up in this video, but I can't help but feel that they are. Now, for all of the problems I've outlined with smartphones, it's important to note that yes, they are incredible tools. If they weren't, they wouldn't be so widespread. They've made our lives much easier, more productive, and they offer many advantages that people 50 years ago simply didn't have. This is precisely why I'm concerned about them. They are a very important part of modern society, so let's try to find a safe and meaningful way of using them before they wind up causing more damage than we'd like.